Welcome to the Geek 101 podcast, Road to Crisis, Episode 1. I'm your host, Andy Bowman, and with me today are special guests, Tessa and Sam. Say hello to the audience, Tessa, Sam.
Hello.
Hello.
Now, before we dive in or begin this deep dive into the beautiful, amazing, and frustrating CW Arrowverse, why don't the two of you give us just a little bit of your background, a little information about the two of you?
Well, I am currently a graduate student, and I am doing my dissertation work right now. I'm also a self-proclaimed geek who's very interested in comic books, and I have to admit that I'm definitely more of a Marvel person. I grew up reading X-Men comics, but this particular property definitely drew me into sort of some more DC comics than I had been previously exposed to.
Okay, Sam?
Hi. I am an assistant professor of English. I do English education stuff. I also work with young adult literature, and which has some really clear tie-ins with comics, but also my favorite show of all time is Lost, which ruined me for all other TV shows, and will come up later, not just because Tommy Merlin spoiled the ending of it for Oliver in the pilot.
Also, I guess, I guess there is a lot of tie-ins to Lost, especially with the first season or two of Arrow. Okay, let's kind of get started. I'm gonna just talk for a second about what this series is, because what's happening for people who care to listen, care to join in. The CW Arrowverse is having a massive crossover that's supposed to be building on countless hundreds of episodes of their previous seasons, all their shows, Arrow, The Flash, Legends of Tomorrow, Supergirl, Black Lightning. This is supposed to be building up to this, and I thought it was a good idea to have a podcast primer covering in relatively solid depth the different happenings of each individual season of some of these shows. And on this episode, we're covering the first 3 seasons of Arrow and the first season of The Flash. So let's go ahead and just start with Arrow Season 1. We are doing spoilers. We are spoiling so much because you just kind of have to do that. There's not too many big reveals as far as spoilers go, but a lot of people say that the first 2 seasons of Arrow are probably the best, and we'll be getting into a discussion with that as we get closer to Legends of Tomorrow, which in my opinion is the best of these shows. All right, let's start with Arrow Season 1. Tessa or Sam, do you want to try to give just a recap of, first of all, I guess, the premise of Arrow?
So the premise of Arrow is basically Oliver Queen, who is very much styled after the Bruce Wayne of Batman mold. He's a billionaire playboy, is shipwrecked on an island. He's there, we are led to believe, in the first season for 5 years. And at the beginning of the show picks up with him getting rescued from this island and being brought back to Starling City, his home. And his sort of gradual, or not so gradual, development into a vigilante who is intent on saving his city, but also punishing those who have made it into sort of this capitalist dystopia. I think that's a pretty good recap of the premise. Anything you want to add, Sam? No? Okay.
All right. Yeah, I agree. That's a solid recap. This is very much... it takes a lot of heart from, I think, the Christopher Nolan Batman movies. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, I think that, and this becomes one of the show's constant problems with DC in general, is that it almost seems like Greg Berlanti wanted to make Batman and had to settle for this character because I think from the very first episode on, he is, riffing off of Batman mythos, mostly from Nolan, but you see it from other sources later on in the series as well.
And there's one thing, like the first season of this, I don't think it delves nearly as far into the DC universe as the other later seasons. You guys agree?
Oh, I agree. And I think part of that is because this was really the first show we had seen like this. We were just talking about this the other day. This was before Marvel had even gotten into television with their comic book properties. So this was really the first comic book show that they had out there. And so I think there was a lot of, I can't know this obviously, but I think there might have been a lot of trepidation about making it a large universe right from the get-go. I think they wanted it to sort of be a self-contained story so they could manage it a little bit better. But unfortunately, later on, there is sort of this sleight of hand that happens with especially Arrow, where Arrow will introduce things from the DC universe like Suicide Squad or other characters, but then those properties get taken away from them because DC wants to keep their television and their film properties separate. So I think that the first season especially does a really good job of telling a self-contained story while giving us little winks and nods. I mean, the very first scene of the first episode, you see the image of Deathstroke's mask with an arrow through it. So it does like to have this sort of tongue-in-cheek reference to the rest of the universe, even when it's not really using those properties.
Right. And it's kind of interesting. This show actually started a year after Smallville finally ended, and for the I guess the first 6 or so months before I even started watching Arrow, I thought that this was a spin-off of that because the Oliver Queen character in Smallville was at some points very, very important because they could not have the rights to Batman. So I don't know. Have either of you watched Smallville?
I watched, I guess, I don't know how much farther I made it after Michael Rosenbaum left. I remember watching the finale, and I had been out for a few seasons at that point, so I had really no idea what was going on. But the first few seasons of Smallville, I really enjoyed. And so, that's why I ultimately gave Arrow a try when they decided to do a new series.
Yeah, and I just thought it was just a spin-off, but when I finally got around to starting it starting Arrow, I was really surprised by just the general quality of the show, especially compared to Smallville. I think CW put in a lot more money in the budget, but okay, let's just talk about a few of the key points from season 1. Do you guys remember any of the major plot points? Oliver gets back in town. He immediately tries to become a vigilante, and he seems pretty okay with killing people at this point, right?
Yes, and I think that's one of the really interesting tensions in the first 2 seasons, really, but especially in the first one. He is okay with killing because, as we sort of find out, he's had to kill, he's had to do some pretty unspeakable things in order to survive on the island. And so the tension becomes, are the same skills that he needed on the island the skills that he needs to be a vigilante or a superhero? And I think that informs a lot of the underlying tensions in Oliver, but also between Oliver and other characters throughout the first couple of seasons. Is he has all these skills, he has this ability, and he seems pretty okay, like you said, with killing, but are those same skills, do those same skills qualify him to be a hero or to be a vigilante? Does he need to change in any sort of way, or is this the only way that his mission can get accomplished?
Right. And a major there's one scene in season 1 during my rewatch that I realized they actually hinted quite hard that he did get off the island in his time. There's a scene where he just comes to a Russian mobster, speaks perfect Russian, and lets them know that he's Bratva. And I was stunned. I had forgotten this, and I had thought they were just kind of doing the 5-year flashback willy-nilly, but apparently they had planned that. Did you guys happen to remember that?
I remember that from the pilot the first time I saw it, and what's interesting, watching the pilot again for this, I was struck by how much I don't think they knew what they were going to do over the next 5 years, although clearly they had some plans, and those plans came off in the end. So it's interesting that they clearly had a plan, but I think there was a lot of flexibility in that plan, and I think the show really ended up in some different ways than they imagined, although not the Bratva plot, which was a stronger thing in later seasons.
Yeah. So part of the real strength of this is the 5-year flashback framing, where every episode has basically 2 timelines where it's running. One where Oliver Queen is stuck on the island and dealing with those trials and tribulations, and the other where, in present day, this is kind of the main storyline. You can definitely feel like, oh, this is Lost. This has the same framing for characters, especially because oftentimes it seems kind of coincidental that the themes of the flashback are also being repeated in the present day, right?
Yes, and the thing about Lost that is, it not only are they taking the narrative framework from Lost, and it becomes a lot more coincidental because in Lost you're doing flashbacks based on a variety of characters. Here it's always centered on Oliver, so they really have to make it germane to whatever he's doing that week, whereas Lost you have a lot more options. But the other thing I'll say about the connection between Lost and Arrow that I think is really interesting is Lost did end it ended in 2010, so it ended a couple of years before Arrow came on. And I think what Lost did, particularly when Carlton Cuse and Damon Lindelof made the deal with ABC that they were going to do X amount of episodes over X amount of seasons, and they know an end, and this is what we're going to do. That really changed the business of TV, and CW was going through a transitional time when Arrow started. One Tree Hill had just ended. I just looked. Gossip Girl was coming to an end. And so they were looking for some new things. And so when they decided to do this superhero thing, I just wonder how much of a conversation was had where Greg Berlanti had to say, this is what I want to do. And I think that's all influenced by Lost.
Yeah, and I imagine, trying to pitch this to CW, hey, we need a lot of money to keep these rights, to keep Warner Brothers happy. And we also can't use anything that you guys are planning on doing with your Man of Steel, Batman versus Superman, Justice League, DC Universe crossover, which you can tell in season 2 of Arrow, they get some rights to do some things, and then those are ripped away.
Oh, yes. We were just talking the other day about how Deathstroke only seems to appear in this show whenever they plan on not using him in the films.
Yeah, man. There are some fantastic changes, but so we have Oliver Queen, and Oliver Queen is definitely supposed to be Batman, right? Like, I'm not familiar enough with the comic source to tell you if this is a super faithful adaptation of Green Arrow, as far as just like, oh, this is totally Batman.
Well, I know that eventually I may be wrong about this because like you, I'm not super familiar with his background, but from what I have read in sources, it seemed like the origin story was later grafted on at some point after the character had been created. He was always this combination of Batman and Robin Hood. But watching the pilot of the show, all I could think was the voiceover from the 1966 Adam West Batman talking about millionaire playboy Bruce Wayne at stately Wayne Manor, because that's what Oliver is.
Yeah, he's definitely leaning hard into it, especially earlier on when he has to keep Diggle at bay and basically try to keep everyone at bay. Yeah. So let's go over just the ancillary characters. Do you guys want to introduce one of your favorite characters first?
Well, speaking of Diggle, he's actually one of my favorite characters in the series, and what's interesting is that Diggle did not exist in the comic books before this series started. John Diggle is a character that was created for this series, and it has since been introduced in the comic books as the result of his popularity on this series. He's introduced fairly early on. I think it's in the first episode that he's introduced as a sort of bodyguard protection that Oliver's mother hires for him. He's ex-military, and after Oliver slips from his guard several times, he starts getting very suspicious about what Oliver is doing when he's slipping away, and so he eventually does discover the secret identity that Oliver has been hiding, and instead of turning him in, he actually does end up teaming up with Oliver. He sort of functions in a lot of ways like Oliver's conscience, even though he is military and even though he does have a lot of sympathy for Oliver's cause, and he's not necessarily against the killing. He does try to sort of act as this voice of reason for Oliver, especially when Oliver tries to apply some of those survival tactics to life in Starling City as a vigilante. Diggle often is the one who says, maybe we should pull this back a little bit. Maybe you should think about what you're doing. So Diggle actually ends up working in that way, but he also is just a great ally for Oliver in a lot of ways too.
And you'd say Diggle's kind of member one of Team Arrow, right?
I think he is the first member of Team Arrow. Which brings me to my other point about season 1. The first couple episodes, and I was reminded of this last night as we were watching the pilot, the first couple episodes of Arrow, because Oliver doesn't have anyone to talk to, because Diggle is not in on it yet, Felicity isn't in on it yet, there's a lot of Oliver monologuing. He just talks a lot in the first couple of episodes because he has to let us as an audience in on what he's doing, what he's thinking about. That monologuing definitely gets pulled back as he starts having members of his team like Diggle and Felicity join him. Instead of monologuing, we actually get dialogue then. And I think that might be one of the weirder aspects of the first season, is just how much voiceover there is in those first couple of episodes.
Now Oliver's mission at the beginning is because he has this freaking book, right? What did you guys think of that as you were watching this the first time? He just has this book with all these names down.
I mean, it's really his MacGuffin notebook, isn't it? I mean, it's not. I mean, we've seen this too. Like, I guess to borrow from another show on another network, The Blacklist, like, which I definitely have not watched more than a season of. But the whole, at some point, the list is just a reason, right? It's a reason to have a monster of the week or a villain of the week or whatever episode, but it's really not important. And whenever they talk about it, it's not very interesting.
Well, it's really weird too, because the whole conceit of the book is that his father, who was on the ship with him when it went down and who kills himself in front of Oliver, he gives him this mission, right? He says, like, I have done all these bad things. I'm not the person you think I am. Here's this book. And then he kills himself. And so Oliver, he figures out that the people in this book are not good people, and that's why he's going after them. But at the same time, he doesn't really know why he's going after them. Like, it's a very odd, like, he doesn't have all of the information, and it seems like a very flimsy reason to just be like, oh, these people are terrible, and my father said they were terrible, so let's cross all the names off this book. I'm not completely sure. The book seems like it functions as a plot device more than anything else.
It's like if Robin Hood just wanted to like kill rich people for fun and said, "Oh yeah, it's because I'm going to give it to the poor," but doesn't really care about that. That's how it reads in the show during the first season.
Right, and that I remember watching that, and the reveal that his father like kills himself in front of Oliver after killing the other guy who survived. Like I really enjoyed that kind of just reveal. It gave a certain power to the 5-year framing story.
Well, and the 5-year flashback works really well in the early seasons because it allows you to have the information of an origin story, but with the immediacy of being in the middle of the vigilante storyline. So instead of spending a season telling us how Oliver became the way he is, we have the immediacy. He's already there. He's already doing vigilante work, but then the flashbacks give us sort of that pathos that origin stories usually give us. So we sort of get both without having to sort of go through the formulaic, just the origin story first.
Which is a nice contrast from Smallville, where the entire series is an origin story, sort of.
Yeah, no. The whole thing with Smallville was the very last scene. You finally get to see a brief glimpse of him in his blue leotard. Well, we also introduce a character who plays a major role in the rest of Arrow, in Tommy Merlin, right?
Yes, he'll be around for a while. Get emotionally attached to him.
It's a shame because I really like Tommy Merlin, as you can tell, and like I said, spoilers. Tommy dies at the end of this season.
It's because he spoiled Lost. You don't do that. It's not okay. He had
the
it
ultimate. We also have introduction of Thea Queen.
I just wanted to say about Thea, I was really surprised watching the pilot episode. Thinking about it, Diggle, I think, is just a really important part of the series. But seeing Katie Cassidy as her original Laurel,
yeah.
And seeing the Merlin family, and even Oliver's mom and the other guy. Yeah,
Walter?
I forgot about
Is that
him.
his name?
Yeah. I really realized from the pilot on, and I never would have thought this if I hadn't rewatched, how important Willa Holland is to this show. I think that when we started shedding characters, we shed the wrong character. I really wish Thea had stayed with us all the way through the series.
And we also have Oliver's mother, Moira Queen, who the constant cliffhangers that shows like this seem to need in their season story arc at the end of every episode, she's usually the one behind it, where you find out that she's the one who sunk the Queen's Gambit or something like that, or she knows something more than what she's saying, or there's a second book. Right? She almost serves exclusively just as her own MacGuffin, right?
Yes. And she may be part of the reason why I originally, during the original run of the show, stopped after 9 episodes and didn't come back until The Flash had started, so a couple seasons later. And I think that was part of the show that didn't work for me. I just did not care about any of these family things, and I'm so glad Arrow finally got rid of that once they figured out what their identity was a little bit more.
Right. And they reveal, I believe it's in episode 3, I think the first real tie-in to the bigger DC universe here with Deadshot. Yeah, it is episode 3. They finally introduce just something that ties everything together, at least to like a more recognizable, more palatable villain in Deadshot instead of random mobsters. They introduce him. They go through. We are slowly introduced to Felicity Smoke, who pretty much becomes Oracle, right?
Yeah, I have lots of feelings about what happens to Felicity throughout the show. Although I will say, after watching a couple of the earlier episodes last night, I like early Felicity. Like, early Arrow Felicity is pretty great. Like, she's the nerdy computer magic hacker, you know, the basic point of which is that she can just type any code into any computer and stuff happens. But she has a lot of personality. She's very non-judgmental in the early seasons, which is so weird because she becomes one of the judgiest characters ever by the end of the series. But she has this really great chemistry with both Oliver and with Diggle, and with the other characters that they run into. But she's also sort of supposed to act as the viewers' entry into the Arrow team, because, you know, Diggle's ex-military. He's a badass in his own right. You know, Oliver survived on and off this island for 5 years. He's supposed to be like a badass in his own right. But Felicity is just supposed, at the beginning of the series, she's just supposed to be like this every woman, right? She's, you know, kind of awkward and kind of klutzy, but she has these really special skills that add something to the team. But she's also provides a lot of comic relief, which I think the show kind of needed at the beginning, because there is sort of this relentlessness of gritty Oliver remembering traumatic things that happened to him on the island that I think Felicity sort of serves to break up a little bit.
Right. And then other characters talk about one, Laurel, who, just Laurel. She's a character.
Hey, if Laurel was any more compelling of a character, we would have never gotten Sarah, so...
True. Then we have, Paul Blackthorne as Laurel's father, who is the detective, kind of the Gordon to Oliver's Batman, which, you know, just kind of I really like him as an actor. This is not his season.
Well, and it's also, last night while we were watching the pilot again, I was like, who's letting him investigate any cases about Oliver? Like, the entire city, including him, thinks that Oliver was responsible for the death of his daughter. Why is he even close to this at all? But, I mean, comic book TV logic, I guess.
Well, and I think for the entire first season of Arrow, both times I went through it, in my own headcanon, he was also Wizard Harry Dresden. So I wasn't quite willing to let that go. I wanted to see Blackthorne as this character in the Arrowverse be able to do magic as well. It's very disappointing.
And following, we have Colton Haynes. His introduction is Roy Harper, who everyone knows is pretty much the Robin to Oliver's Batman, right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I think that's the primary purpose that he serves for most of his run on the series.
Yeah, and what's I was reading a little bit about the Green Arrow's background. His original sidekick in the comics is Speedy, which is Thea's nickname. So I thought it was interesting that a lot of his sidekick got shunted over to where Roy was, but a lot of it also got split up into Thea's character, including apparently a heroin addiction, which Thea later struggles with a couple of different forms of addiction. So it's interesting that original character kind of gets severed into two for the TV series.
Yeah, that was one of the big moments in comics, I remember, is when Speedy gets addicted to smack.
Do you think they knew what they were going to do with Thea Queen, though, in this first season? Because I agree, I think Thea Queen is one of the best characters in this show, but the first season she's very much Kid's sister. Like, she's very much, you know, that kid who is also dealing with her own trauma, who Oliver has to save from drug dealers, and she doesn't seem like she has a lot of external motivation.
Yeah, I don't know. I think mentioning that her nickname is Speedy kind of lent to her season 2 arc, discovering who her father is and all that. But just to kind of keep things moving, we also have, I think, the two best actors of this season in Manu Bennett playing Slade Wilson, which was a great reveal, I think, where just it's in a flashback and he introduces himself, and after beating the crap out of Oliver and being kind of a general badass, Slade Wilson, who DC fans will know as Deathstroke, and then John Barrowman as Malcolm Merlyn / the Dark Archer. What did you guys think about those two characters?
Well, I mean, Manu Bennett is definitely, his acting definitely saves certain parts of season 2, which I know we'll get into here in a little bit. But he does a really great job with Slade Wilson. I think mainly because he has this ability to be really gruff and very macho, but at the same time show a lot of vulnerability and show a lot of emotions that are going on behind, the sort of that Deathstroke persona, which again doesn't really get developed until season 2. But I like that he's introduced in season 1 because I think that makes the reveal of season 2 a little bit stronger. I like that he has this bond with Oliver. They go through some trauma together. And so, they're friends. I mean, that's really what season 1 is about, is that they're surviving together, and he teaches, Oliver some things about how to survive on this island. And so I think that makes, his role as Deathstroke in season 2 even better.
Yeah, and I think that Greg Berlanti's two biggest casting coups that he has done to really strengthen the Arrowverse is bringing Captain Jack Barrowman over from Doctor Who and casting him in this and getting that audience. And then the other one, which we'll talk about later, is John Wesley Shipp on The Flash. Those were two really brilliant casting moves that I think John Barrowman brings in a lot of Doctor Who viewers into the CW. And I think the second one with one of the original Flashes was good for a different reason entirely.
Well, I think John Barrowman too is just he's just having so much fun playing Malcolm Merlyn, and you can kind of tell. I mean, not in a cheesy way, just in a he really, I think, loves this role because he does it with such chilling elegance in the first season, especially. And I mean, I know he gets involved in other things later that maybe dilute the character's villainy a little bit, but in the first season, I remember the first time I watched it thinking I'm used to seeing this guy playing Captain Jack. He's suddenly, this hard to read character who's planning all these villainous things.
All right. And for those of you who do not know, Captain Jack is John Barrowman's character from Doctor Who and Torchwood. And the best way to describe Captain Jack is that every moment, every time you're watching something, and there's one character with a gun and another character, usually the bad guy, holding one in either a random civilian or something, and you're screaming at the TV, just shoot! Just shoot! Captain Jack is the one who shoots before you can start screaming that.
Well said. Yeah,
that's pretty accurate, I think.
He's also immortal, which makes him great. But him and Malcolm Merlyn, who's the dark mirror of Oliver Queen, he's another rich person who has all the special skills and abilities as the Green Arrow, and works as the major villain for this season.
And he's just another character that reinforces the theme of father issues, right? Which of course we got from Batman. So there's even more of that there.
Well, and I think too, describing him as a dark mirror, the first couple seasons of Arrow work really well because Oliver has all of these foils that sort of present what ifs if Oliver didn't have this sort of drive for justice. We get Malcolm Merlyn, who's the villain, and it's what if he took all these skills and had a twisted vision of what justice looked like. Or you have, for an example, the Huntress is a character that shows up in season 1. She is looking for her own brand of justice, which is really revenge, and Oliver gives her the skills to get that revenge without realizing that her motives are less than pure. You have all these characters who are sort of introduced with similar traumas to Oliver or similar skills, but they all kind of ask the same questions in different ways, which I think works really well in this series. You get all these like different versions of the same story, but it causes the viewer to ask, like, is Oliver doing the right thing, or is this other person doing the right thing? You know, how can you look at this issue from different perspectives?
And now that we have the cast of Arrow Season 1 and kind of discussed their abilities and the strengths of the season, I don't think there's really much to talk about as far as the actual core of the season plotline. Do you guys agree with that? Like, it's pretty villain of the week, right?
Yeah, I mean, and then by the end, Malcolm Merlyn tries to make the city crumble, I guess. Like, it's like a very comic booky plot line where he's like trying to literally cause an earthquake to kill all the poor people. Like that's literally his plan, is kill all the poor people. So there's a little bit of an anti-capitalist strain, I think, in Arrow, because you do get these villains that are these titans of industry trying to take advantage of the city.
Well, it's interesting too that the Glades become, you know, something that is kind of an object in season 1. And then you forget about that, and then in later seasons of the Arrow, all of a sudden, we're doing the same thing again, sort of.
Yeah.
With the division between the Glades and the rest of Starling, for now, City.
And for those of you who don't know, the Glades are the poor part of town. They're basically the area where everyone who isn't in the 1% live.
And a few interesting things about the ending of the season, as Malcolm Merlyn is about to, you know, be defeated. There's this moment where Oliver is holding this beaten John Barrowman, and John Barrowman just says, "The one thing I've learned as a businessman is redundancy." And it's this reveal that is really, I think, mirrors the famous scene from Watchmen where you find out that it's already happened. In many ways, the heroes have lost, right?
Well, yeah, and I mean, and the death of Tommy, like, I think that was one of the strengths of season 1 too, is that like there were stakes, and you know those stakes did get capitalized on. I mean, Tommy does die because of his father's plan, so it's not just, you know, this almost happened and our hero saved the day. I mean, there is real damage that's caused, even though Oliver manages to sort of avert some of the damage. You know, he sort of is able to help clean up a little bit, but you know, people die, and that becomes something that is a key plot point in season 2 as well.
Right, and with that, I think, are there any other things you guys just want to mention about season 1 in general?
No, I mean, I think it was honestly kind of a solid season. I mean, it had some kinks to work out, but some good stuff in it. And,
well, I guess the one thing we should mention if we're going to talk about season 2 next is watch out. There's a early version of Sarah Lance who does not survive into season 2.
We had totally forgotten that Katie Lotz, who plays Sarah Lance, Sarah Lance is a character that's shown in the pilot episode, but they actually had to refilm the one scene that she's in the flashback because they changed actresses. So Katie Lotz is actually Sarah Lance, and she's introduced in season 2. So if you're watching Arrow for the first time, the first Sarah Lance you see is not the one that will be important later.
Right, incredibly important later.
Right, yes. Sarah Lance is clearly one of the best characters in the Arrowverse.
Yeah. So, let's go ahead and open up on season 2. All right. Before we get into it, what did you guys think of season 2 as compared to season 1?
I loved season 2 when I first watched it.
It's much better than season 1.
I think season 2 might be the best season of Arrow. And I think a large part of that, like we mentioned before, is because of Deathstroke, specifically Manu Bennett's acting. I think Deathstroke as a character provides a lot more personal of a foe for Oliver. He knows all of Oliver's secrets. He knows a lot of Oliver's weaknesses. He's able to challenge Oliver on both a physical level, but also like a philosophical, moral level. And I think that it works really well, even though you don't even know he's the real villain for the first half of the season. I think there's a lot about that character that really just, I don't know. It makes it feel a lot more immediate and a lot more urgent for the viewers.
Right. And I really think that the last 9 episodes of this season are probably the strongest in the entire Arrowverse. But we'll get to that in a second. We have a few new characters who come in season 2, but season 2 starts with Oliver back on Lian Yu because he failed, and this is kind of his penance, and he wants to be alone and away from everything. It's interesting. You have Oliver's mother who's in jail because she had something to do with this mass destruction. And you also have Roy, who's trying to figure out and be the Green Arrow in the place of everyone else. You get this feeling that the city is really different without the Hood. And the Hood is what they call the Green Arrow at this point in time.
Yeah, I was about to say he doesn't really start using the name Green Arrow until I don't know what season it is. I'd have to look that up.
Well,
but
Arrow comes first, and
right.
then Green Arrow is used to differentiate from Arrow. Like at first they were, if I'm remembering right, all the different times we've changed hoods and peoples and hoods and who we're calling hoods. I believe Green Arrow actually happens because whoever Green Arrow is to say that no, I'm not Arrow. I'm a different person.
You're a different person.
But Arrow is who the Hood eventually gets to be known as.
Right. I think he's the Hood for the first 2 seasons, though. Am I
right? He becomes the Arrow when he decides to stop killing.
That's right. Yes. Okay.
Well, and that's interesting. The interesting thing about season 2 is I think that starting off on Lian Yu is also one really good way of showing that the beginning of season 2 is almost a second pilot episode. It's almost it's a soft reboot of the show, I think, because he's not killing anymore. We recast Sarah Lance. We really get some better stories going in season 2, and I kind of get the feeling that Greg Berlanti wanted to start that way, wanted to give viewers an entry point. Because he had to know when the season started because, about the backdoor Flash pilot that comes in season 2, knew that at that point he was going to be building to something else. And so I think from the beginning of season 2, we get a course correction into the different kind of stakes, the different kinds of stories, the different kind of ethics that are going to kind of come across the entire Arrowverse as it eventually winds up being. And I think the beginning of season 2 gives a really good entry point into that.
Well, and you almost, now that you've said that, that almost makes me think that season 1 might have also suffered a little bit from just proof of concept. Like, there's this idea that we have to be able to, sell this show as a show that more than people that just like comic books will like. And so maybe that's why they didn't connect it as much to the rest of the universe. But once season 1 did fairly well, season 2, they're planning on opening it up to the Flash. They're planning on starting this story building in a way that they just weren't able to do in season 1. We do get, the Suicide Squad episode in season 2 as well. So there is this sense, I guess, that season 2 might be a soft reboot, like you said, just because they were planning on doing so much more than they had been able to do in season 1.
Yeah, and without going off into too much of a tangent about the CW was very much trying to figure out who they were now and who they were going to be. Supernatural was really the only thing that was going strong. The Vampire Diaries were also there, but Sarah Michelle Gellar had just come back that season before and did Ringer. And everybody thought, well, Buffy's back on the CW. Well, that show got canceled. Heart of Dixie was the other show on the CW where they were trying to capture Rachel Bilson, trying to recapture what she had on the OC. Interesting, Heart of Dixie eventually has, co-star on that who will eventually become Black Lightning. But the CW is trying to figure out who it is, and I think after the first season of Arrow, one thing that they know they are going to be is the home of the Arrowverse, and I think from that point, Greg Berlanti almost gets that blank check that he can do whatever he wants. And we start seeing that
the
unfold.
rise of Greg Berlanti television.
Right from the beginning of season 2. You can chart everything from there. And season 1 really is a proof of concept in that way.
Yeah. I mean, right away, we also get introduced to the character who has been in charge of Oliver Queen's company at the very beginning, and geeks will immediately recognize Summer Glau.
Indeed.
Which I had totally forgotten before we rewatched this, that she had been in this show at all.
Yeah, it's fascinating, but she's in there briefly as Isabel Rochev. And this is also the season that I think really starts to introduce and just tie together a bunch of DC lore. You have Brother Blood, who fans of the Teen Titans first animated show will recognize. You've got Deathstroke in full Deathstroke regalia. You have Black Canary. You have... I'm trying to think of the other major ones. You get introduced to Amanda Waller. You get introduced to the Suicide Squad. You get introduced to Bronze Tiger. You know, so many, I think, truly interesting and good ways to tie this into the DC lore altogether, right?
Yeah, no, I would definitely agree with that. And it's interesting you mentioned Amanda Waller as well. I mean, Amanda Waller, we've had this conversation a lot. She ends up sort of being this recurring antagonist, throughout a few seasons of Arrow. I mean, Argus continues to be an important part of the Arrowverse. And I mean, we see Argus in other shows. I mean, Argus shows up in The Flash and shows up, I don't know if it shows up in Legends all that much. But Argus is, of course, the super secret, shadowy military intelligence agency that Amanda Waller runs for a long time and employs rather questionable ethical and legal punishments towards people.
It's like if S.H.I.E.L.D. was run by Hydra, but for real.
Right. I mean,
not
I know,
pretending.
I know Sam is very much not a fan of the Amanda Waller character. No. But yeah, I mean, I think Argus is important because it sort of positions itself in this way that it asks us to think about what Oliver is doing, right? When Oliver tortures someone for information, is he better than Argus, right? Is he more heroic in some way because he's not doing it for the government? I think that's what's really interesting about this show is that you see Oliver do these things. I mean, he's trying not to kill anymore, although it is notable to say he does still kill a couple of people in season 2. So it's definitely not a cold turkey, type of behavior that he has. But I think what's interesting is that you just get to meet these characters that do things that Oliver does, and it causes Oliver to sort of question the legitimacy of those things.
Right. And, with season 2, you also have the introduction of Sarah Lance and the League of Assassins.
Batman!
More
Batman.
This is... Yeah, this is so hard on... just so hardcore Batman, because you have Sarah Lance coming back and as Black Canary, who, that's neat. But hearing Ra's al Ghul and the League of Assassins, is it in episode 1 of season 2, or is it?
No, it's in the episode where Sarah is revealed to be Sarah, I believe, where she talks about how she was in she talks about, because she is working in, at the beginning of season 2, there's this shadowy person, vigilante, who's also working in Starling City. It's still Starling City, right?
Until the end of season 3.
I think it's still Starling City, and she's she's beating up on all of the perverts and the rapists and the all these bad men in Starling City, and we can tell she's the anyone who's read the comics knows that she's Black Canary because of the outfit. And eventually Oliver, as the Green Arrow or as the Hood, catches up with her, and it's revealed to be Sarah Lance, who we all thought was dead, although apparently Oliver knew she was alive this whole time. He just wasn't very forthcoming about it. And then she, as they're sort of catching up, she reveals to him that she's been with the League of Assassins this whole time, which he did not know. And basically, yeah, she sort of provides this soft introduction, and of course she's left them, and so they're after her, and they're trying to get her to come back or to kill her. It's not completely clear exactly what they're after. But Katie Lotz is wonderful in this role. She has such a great character arc through her time on Arrow and, of course, her time on Legends. And what's interesting is that, even rewatching her introduction in season 2, her character grows a lot from that character. She's killing people, in Arrow. At the very beginning, and again, they seem to be bad people, but she admits to slitting a man's throat while he's asleep in bed. She says I'm a terrible person, I've had to do terrible things to survive. We get to see a little of her trauma, right, because the 5-year flashback includes her this season. So it's really interesting to see where she goes. They kind of position her in a way where she has a lot of room to grow.
Right. And this season also introduced kind of this multiple villains at the same time. You have Brother Blood, you have Count Vertigo, you have them being pulled by the strings being pulled by Deathstroke. This is this really interesting thing where they start balancing, like comic books do, multiple different lines. I'm trying to think, is there anything with Felicity and Laurel, or Felicity and Oliver? Does that start up in this season?
Well, we were talking about this last night. They really couldn't. If I were to say there was one of the major weaknesses, I guess I should say, for the first 2 seasons, is they clearly wanted to do something romantic with Oliver, but they couldn't quite figure out the chemistry, because the first season it's all about him and Laurel. Because Laurel was his girlfriend before he left, and of course he cheated on her with her sister. Oliver was not a great guy before the island. But there's, and Katie Cassidy is obviously a bigger name than a lot of the people that were on the show at the beginning, and so they clearly wanted to put them together, but then they didn't. They got together by the end of season 1, but then because Tommy dies, they are separated, and it's like they really didn't know what to do with Oliver romantically. They didn't even really know what to do. Felicity, I know that people started shipping Olicity at this point, which we'll talk about later, but but there's not really any indication of that in season 2 from the show. We get to see, I guess there's a little bit. Oliver gets a little proprietary over Felicity when Barry Allen comes to town in the backdoor pilot. But again, it's like they didn't really know where to go with some of these storylines.
Well, and I think this is part of where I question Berlanti and the writers as to how much they knew what they were going to do. I think Katie Cassidy and Stephen Amell just don't have chemistry, and I think by the end of the first season we're pretty clear on that. And I think you can credit that as much as anything else, probably, with Katie Lotz's introduction as Sarah Lance. And I think you can. When people did start shipping Olicity, I wonder how much that has to do with Sarah Lance's eventual being written off the show, at least initially in the 3rd season. It's kind of like we have to have a romantic interest, but we have to figure out what to do with these characters. With Sarah Lance, we'll kill her, but with Laurel, we'll give her a drug problem. That'll be fun, right? If she can't be a romantic interest, maybe drugs are interesting. We do that. So she gets that in season 2, and that's just not fun at all.
Yeah, it's not a great look for Laurel, and it's not that I question the introduction of the drugs and alcohol storyline as much as it is the coding of that storyline. She gets, that seems to be her only purpose in season 2 is to be addicted to drugs and to have these super emotional scenes with Oliver and her dad denying that she's addicted to drugs. There doesn't seem to be much, again, like Thea, there doesn't seem to be a lot of external motivation for her in these earlier seasons.
Right. And by this time I had finally caught up and I was watching weekly. And this season really starts the multiple episode arcs with Moira Queen being in jail. You know, you have it build up to a pretty good courtroom case, I thought, at the time for what this is. This is not a courtroom movie or a TV show.
Oh boy.
Oh, when we get to the later seasons, I have lots of problems with the way they write courtroom scenes in this show. But this was not bad. This was not a bad version of that.
Yes. I don't know that CW in the Arrowverse. I don't think probable cause is a real thing. By the way, that's not part of the universe. We'll just leave it there.
Right, and we have as an introduction to one of the biggest holy shit moments for me was when Barry Allen came into the picture. I was not following the news at this point. I wasn't really knowing anything about this. I was just like, okay, this is a fun show to watch. And then Barry Allen comes in, and there's this whole thing, at least for me as a viewer, like, oh, is he already the Flash? And you find out by the end that no, or by the next few episodes that no, he is not the Flash yet. Did you guys have any reactions to seeing good old Barry?
I mean, I also, when I watched this, and granted, I was not current with this until probably season 3, so I remember not really paying attention as well and being like, oh, Barry Allen, like, that name sounds really familiar, and realizing that it was the Flash as well. I think as far as those 2 episodes go, it's a really solid backdoor pilot for the Flash, because even though we don't really get to meet any of the other characters from the Flash, Barry Allen is fleshed out pretty well in those 2 episodes, and it doesn't take away from the Arrow storyline. And that's usually the problem I have with backdoor pilots, is basically, oh, we're just going to take a break from the show this week and talk about something else. But this actually managed to introduce Barry Allen and sort of the concerns that he has while still forwarding the Arrow storyline.
It's more like an extended screen test in the form of an actual episode where, basically you get that feedback. Could this person be Barry Allen? And you don't have to prove a concept for a show, because I'm pretty sure by this time the CW was like, just take all our shows, just take them. But
I love that he's like always late for everything, like in the backdoor pilot, like he's impossible. It's impossible for him to be anywhere on time, which I will say, when I did first watch it, I had kind of the similar, like, maybe he's just faking it and he already has his super speed. But like, I like that that's like part of the joke, is that before he becomes the Flash, he's really not that speedy.
Yeah. And I mean, even when he is the Flash, he's still pretty much late to everything.
The only real clunky kind of backdoor piloty is when he's confronted in the scene where, oh, you're lying, you're not lead, you're not a CSI, you're an assistant, you're not supposed to be here, and then he says, well, my dad was framed, and he gives the whole monologue about that. That's the only time we really get a sense of this is something that's going to be something else maybe later. It really has nothing to do with the business of Arrow. It's just kind of shoehorned in there because, well, we had to. But other than that, it's a really good episode.
But even the way he does that, I mean, it is kind of clunky, but it's very compelling at the same time. Like, it's very, he has this real, and we'll talk about the first season of The Flash, but there's this real tonal shift from Arrow to The Flash, but there's still this, like, sense of immediacy you get from that story. Like, this is why I do what I do. And maybe the Arrow would have been able to catch, the person who killed my mother. And it's, there's a lot of earnestness to Grant Gustin's portrayal of Barry Allen that I think really brings him through some clunky dialogue.
Yeah, Barry definitely Uncle Oliver basically is or older brother Oliver or some that dynamic is established very quickly, and then you see it in the pilot of the Flash and throughout the multiple crossovers. Oliver, like it or not, is a mentor, and this episode does establish that too.
Yeah. And let's see here. Just going through, and I think I'm going to go ahead and change this just because we have a lot more to talk about. I think we're just going to do seasons 1, 2, and 3 of Arrow, and we will pick up the Flash next week or week after, if that's okay with you guys. Just because, there's just so much. This series is so much more dense than I remember it being. Also, you kind of get introduced to these characters, and it just, you know who they are, and talking about who they are and the stuff they go through. It's pretty crazy. But we see Barry get hit by lightning, and he goes into a coma, and I was thinking in the back of my head, like, okay, well, anything that happens here, the Flash is going to come and save the day at some point during this season. And that does not happen. Grant Gustin does not come back as a superpowered Flash in this season. And we start this amazing arc at the last half of the season when Manu Bennett comes back and reveals that he's alive and that he's the one who's been pulling all the strings. I think this is beautiful. What do you guys think about Deathstroke coming back?
Oh, I mean, it was really great because the thing is that if you know anything about the comics, you know that Slade Wilson is Deathstroke. Like, you should have known this from season 1, right? But he's such a sympathetic character for, like, season 1 and all the season 2 flashbacks, and Oliver has repeatedly at this point said that he's dead. And so it's not like it's a surprise necessarily, but it is, like, a pretty big, like, how did we get from point A to point B? Like, why is he here and why is he so angry, with Oliver? It's this really great range of acting that Manu Bennett manages to do, where he's very relatable, but he's also terrifying in some ways because he's just 2 steps ahead of Oliver this entire season.
Yeah, it's this great reveal, and the flashbacks of this season really do a good job of showing you, like, it how sympathetic this is. And the second season also introduces you to Anatoly, who is awesome. I really like Anatoly as a character, who pretty much constantly gets betrayed by Oliver.
That's true.
As far as it's considered, Anatoly is just this guy who keeps trusting his friend and keeps getting backstabbed by Oliver because it's more convenient.
Well, isn't that what Anatoly later on trains Oliver to do? Isn't
kinda, yeah. It's man, I really love Anatoly, and it was always a joy to see him pop up on screen. But the whole weird thing with Shadow and Manu Bennett and the introduction of probably the worst part, the Mirakuru.
So here's a fun drinking game. Every time somebody says Mirakuru, you drink. And every time somebody grossly mispronounces it, you drink again. Don't do this because you'll die. I don't know. I don't know how heavy-handed they were with that. It was like, did you know that if you say miracle in Japanese, it's Mirakuru? Well, we're going to say it 100 times and you'll figure it out.
Honestly, for me, the Mirakuru, I know that it drives a lot of the plot points of this season, but it seemed kind of like the book in season 1. Like, it seemed like kind of a cop-out way of explaining why Slade Wilson is evil now. Like, oh, well, he ingested this thing that makes him superpowered, but also really crazy. And I just didn't, that was the least enjoyable part of the entire season for me, because I don't think he needed a reason. I think that there was enough going on. There was enough history between him and Oliver with the death of Shadow, the fact that Oliver chose, to save Sarah over Shadow, and he makes that scene where he makes Oliver choose between Thea and his mother is like one of the most, like, I remember just sitting on the edge of my seat being like, this is Game of Thrones now. Like, we've entered a completely different feel for this show. And I didn't buy the Mirakuru as a reason for this. I didn't need it as a reason for Deathstroke.
If the show were a little bit better or a little bit smarter, not better, smarter, and it probably wouldn't have been successful, but if the show were a little bit smarter, they would have done a lot of work with addiction. Because everybody's addicted to like 17 things at different times in this show. Whether it's drugs, alcohol, Mirakuru, killing, adrenaline, Lazarus pits later on. I mean, everybody's addicted to stuff. And they never, like with the Mirakuru, it could have been interesting if they'd connected that in a meaningful way with the other addictions in the series, but they don't. It's this season's MacGuffin.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Yeah.
I will say, like, the last half of the season, once they introduced Slade Wilson, there's this thing where as you're watching a show and, like, the season's not over, so that this can't be the end of, of the big bad, right? Like, like, okay, well, both sides are going to live, it's going to be fine, but this isn't going to go anywhere. For me, personally, the end of every one of these episodes really resulted in this might be the one where he defeats Slade Wilson and Brother Blood or Summer Glau is the real final antagonist for the season.
Summer Glau's a Terminator. That would have been great. I would have watched that show again.
But yeah, again, like, even her arc wasn't that satisfying because, like, she plays this very, like, she seems very duplicitous and you don't really know what her motives are. But then in the end, she's working for Slade and she's infected with Mirakuru and now she's super strong. Like, it wasn't a very satisfying payoff in some ways.
Right, and she grabs Roy Harper out of Bloodhaven and just, and just takes the Mirakuru, which is Roy Harper's own addiction, and and it ends with just a giant brawl in the street.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, and again, like, it just, the way that that sequence of episodes works to heighten the tension, to make Slade Wilson seem like this potentially unbeatable villain, it really is kind of a letdown in the last episode when it's just like, Oliver just needs to, like, believe in himself, I guess, that he can defeat the Mirakuru, It's kind of, I don't know, it sort of peters out in a way.
I have a question for you, Andy. Is there, so I don't know if we're all in agreement on this. I know Tessa and I are, but letting Zack Snyder run the DC movie universe is probably a mistake. I don't know how you feel about that. I don't know if we can agree on that one.
It was a mistake.
Okay, so my question for you: top 3 DC entertainment expanded universe, whatever you want to call it, mistakes. That's probably number 1, Zack Snyder. And so my question is, I think the 2 and 3, and I don't know which order they go in, but I think they're 2 and 3. Is the absolute refusal to let Batman show up in the Arrowverse at all. There's that fun reference to Bruce Wayne that comes later in a crossover, but just that absolute refusal. Under no circumstances you can't have Batman. But maybe even the greater sin is pulling Deathstroke and not letting them have him, and then letting him have him again, and then taking him away again.
Yeah, because he does show up in later seasons, but then, yeah, they're like, oh, never mind, we want to use him in a movie, so Manu Bennett can't be Deathstroke anymore.
Yeah, is there any worse thing that they've done than those 3 things? Because he's such a great character on this show.
Right. I don't think that there's much worse that they've done. I think that what I really, really would have liked, like this is like my fanboy imagination gone awry. Imagine that they showed the Justice League movie, right? And in the Justice League movie, everything's going normally or whatever. And at some point, you reveal Stephen Amell's Oliver Queen, and you can maybe make it so he's missing an arm. You know, like at some point you do something, and it's very clear that the Arrowverse is a prequel to Zack Snyder's DCEU. I think that could have been cool. I think just in general, their refusal to let anything overlap is really what did the damage.
Well, it's caused both sides of it, the film and the television side, to really suffer in some ways, because yeah, you do get this like inability to decide whether Deathstroke is in the film universe or the show universe. You know, if they do have Deathstroke in the film universe, obviously Manu Bennett's not playing him. You know, it's really caused a lot of problems, I think, with the show. You know, just introducing characters who suddenly they can't use anymore. And I think also the films suffer. I mean, you don't get some of these amazing talents that we've seen. I mean, Grant Gustin is a really great Flash, and you know the fact that they've sort of recast him, even though I think they recast him well in the films. You know, it really causes this separation that I don't think really needs to exist.
Yeah, and just looking at our time recording, because we're over an hour already, because there's just so much to talk about. I think this is a good stopping point, because these are the last 2 seasons, or the first 2 seasons that were completely solo, right? Next year, in season 3, we end up having the Flash and a little fun crossover. But you two, what do you think of these 2 seasons overall? How do they rank in the overall canon? Do you think 2 is better than 1? Do you think 1 is better than 2? Let's start a general kind of list here.
Well, I think 2 is better than 1, just because of Deathstroke. I mean, like you said, that 9-episode sequence is like it might be one of the best sequences as far as serialized storytelling on the CW that I've seen in a really long time. I mean, like I said, season 1, I think, is also still a pretty strong season. It's definitely better than some of the later seasons, but season 2, without a doubt in my mind, is one of the best seasons of Arrow.
I agree.
Actually, before we get too far, Sam, I do want to talk a little bit about how this season wraps up with Deathstroke slowly basically becoming what I imagine Venom is to Spider-Man, where he's just mentally destroying Oliver Queen and the Arrow, right? Like, Deathstroke's just everywhere. Manu Bennett comes in as, like an art seller?
Yeah, he sort of poses, I mean, like, he takes over, through Isabel, Summer Glau's character, he takes over Oliver's company. Basically, Slade Wilson is so angry at Oliver because of their history that he doesn't just want to kill Oliver, he wants to completely destroy him. So he takes away, Queen Consolidated. He takes away, he makes Oliver choose, right, between his sister and his mother, and kills Moira Queen, which I was not expecting that to happen. That was definitely way out of left field. He's promising basically to take away everything from Oliver, and he, for the most part, until the very last episode, he does a pretty damn good job of it.
He's even better at it than Ra's al Ghul will be later.
And that's the other thing that this show can't decide how to say is Ra's al Ghul. Like, it. Yeah. It depends on which character is speaking, depending on what pronunciation you get.
But Deathstroke is such a good mastermind.
Yeah.
Villain.
Well, but the thing is that he's not even just a mastermind. Like, I mean, he's like physically Oliver's match too. Like, I mean, not with just the Mirakuru, which again I think is a cop out. Like, even before that on the island, he's this, special forces, elite fighter. And so he's able, and he taught Oliver a lot of what he knows on the island. So he has this sort of quality where he's not only able to outthink Oliver, but he's also able to outfight him in a lot of ways, which provides for a lot of really, really great, fight scenes, I think, in the later half of the season too.
And we also have a major turn of events with Thea Queen towards the end, correct?
Oh, right. We discover in season 2 that she's actually Oliver's half-sibling. Her father is actually the villain from the first season, Malcolm Merlyn. And so she's actually his daughter. She discovers this in this season and by the end of the season, is taken away by him.
Yeah, which I do want to talk about how funny it is that she clearly has a crush on Tommy.
Don't they mention that? Like, when she finds out that she
has
like this huge crush on Tommy.
I just remembered, like, because there's the whole Tommy and Laurel thing in season 1, and she clearly is 17 years old and just has a crush on Tommy, and it's a really funny moment.
It's a real Star Wars moment.
Yeah, but just Malcolm Merlyn coming in and whisking Thea away really does build into her character, especially with the third season.
Right. Well, and if we're going to say that the beginning of season 2 is really a soft reboot for Arrow, season 3 is really a soft reboot for Thea, I think. Season 2, she provides some really great, she's an important part of season 2. She provides a lot of really great tension between her and Oliver, especially over, him keeping all these secrets from her. She ends up being the only family that he has left by the end of the season. But really, she, again, is sort of just the kid sister. She doesn't have a lot of motivation, and it's really season 3 that we get to see her have her own story arc that's really interesting.
One of the best stories of the early Arrow seasons is you can see them working things out and then applying them to the other shows much earlier. You can see a lot of the issues, a lot of the roadmaps, a lot of the character building that they struggled with in the first couple of seasons. They don't happen as much. They still happen, but they don't happen as much in the later shows. And you can really thank them for paying attention to kind of how they've had to change things in the early seasons of Arrow for that. So they're valuable for that too.
Yeah. And I think one of those things is like the application of female characters. I think they were still trying to work out, which, by the way, we haven't talked about this yet, but Sarah Lance comes out as bi in the second season of Arrow as well, because she does come back and she does date Oliver for a little bit. But then we discover that she also dated the daughter of Ra's al Ghul, and it becomes a really important part of the overall of her storyline, but also the way that Greg Berlanti, who of course is also gay, is really interested in providing diverse backgrounds for these characters and having characters who being gay is an important part of their identity. And so, I think, again, unfortunately he had to do proof of concept in the first season for some of this, but I think in the later shows we get a lot more of that diversity a lot more easily because of what he was able to do in Arrow. Yeah.
And with that, I think it's about time to wrap it up. I love talking about these because these are... I'm going to get a lot more negative later on.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Not all the stuff they try works.
But this didn't have to happen. We didn't have to have an Arrowverse. And I think that there's been a lot of good TV in the last decade. This is one of the best things that's happened on TV, even if a lot of the later seasons aren't as engaging. Just remembering that this is really this expanded universe is really the first of its kind, and they're trying, to build on television, and he's already building his second universe on the CW with the Riverdale universe. I mean, it's crazy what Berlanti's been able to do, and it's it's great. It's great for people who like TV. Period.
Right, and I think people should also remember, first of all, I highly recommend Riverdale. I cannot recommend Riverdale enough. But also, because of this, we actually ended up getting, Berlanti was kind of, this came from basically from Green Lantern. Remember how bad Green Lantern was, the movie?
Yeah, I mean, one of the worst superhero.
Some of us haven't seen it yet, so.
Okay, the only good thing that we got from Green Lantern was Ryan Reynolds and Blake Lively being together. That's it. That is the only good thing.
That is the gift that keeps on giving, yes.
Yeah. And it's fascinating to see how basically Greg Berlanti went from being the screenwriter on Green Lantern to creating this entire this entire beautiful verse. And I look forward to talking with you guys. Also, I keep forgetting that Berlanti is also one of the creators of Titans and Sabrina, which is kind of a spinoff of Riverdale.
But on Netflix.
But I mean, more comic book properties, right? I mean,
Yes.
Riverdale is a comic book property. Sabrina, is in the same universe in the comics as well. So, I mean, obviously Marvel is one of the first shared universe properties in film, but we get, I think that this television, this serialized storytelling sometimes works better for comic book properties, and I think that Greg Berlanti has found some really good ways of telling these stories and connecting these stories within universe.
And I will throw out, there is one other comic book set universe on TV, and that's Kirkman's Little Corner of the World with The Walking Dead. And I think that we know which one is... I think I know which one's better, and it's not the zombie one. Although if they bring zombies to Riverdale, I'm all for it.
I really looking forward to the animated version of Kirkman's other work, Invincible, that Amazon's gonna have sometime soon. Are you guys familiar with it?
Heard of it, but
well, is Kirkman still is he still in charge of Image?
I don't know if he's in charge of Image. I also know
at one time, but I don't know if he still is.
I can't wait to have the episode where we cover the entire Walking Dead run, because that comic is done.
Yes, and I need to catch up and finish it.
Yeah, but Kirkman did a really good job with Invincible, and I highly recommend it. And it's we've got a lot to talk about over the next few weeks as we prepare for the end of Arrow. Arrow is ending with Crisis on Infinite Earths, so this will be an interesting discussion. And next time we're going to cover season 3 of Arrow and the first season of The Flash, where this universe really starts to come. So, Tessa and Sam, do you have any pluggables or things you want to plug? Places where people can find you if you want to share with our audience?
I don't know. Where can people find us? That's a good question. We need to come up with an answer to that question.
Well, you have a Twitter.
Yeah,
I don't
you could
have a Twitter yet.
always make a Twitter.
What's your Twitter handle?
I don't know. Off the top of my head, that's very sad. I don't know where you can
We're very bad at the social media.
Yes.
We'll be better. That'll be our homework. We'll be better by the next time we're on this podcast.
All right. So thank you very much, Tessa and Sam. Listeners, you can find me on Twitter at Hebrews Pale Ale. You can find this podcast anywhere fine podcasts are sold / downloaded at Geek 101 Podcast. You can go find us also on Twitter at Geek 101 Podcast and online at geek101podcast.com. Thanks for listening. Class dismissed.